It's enough of that fucking shit. Losing the war on Christmas. Phil Stein was sure about a lot of things. It was how he made his living. He was, for instance, positive that Barack Obama was a socialist, Muslim, Kenyan terrorist bent on turning the United States into a religious oligarchy. He had his limits, though. For instance, whereas many of his colleagues were completely convinced that Obama was an extraterrestrial reptilian overlord, Phil kept the benefit of the doubt open on that one. He was only 95% sure, give or take. Phil's blog and accompanying podcast, The No Shit Zone, drew in thousands of visitors each week. Phil had theories on everything and loved weaving intricate storylines combining elements of conspiracy theory, science fiction, and misinterpreted fact into elaborate yarns that kept the great unwashed foaming at the mouth for more. What most people didn't realize was that Phil wasn't a political pundit to the right of Attila the Hun, or a nutjob only slightly more unhinged than Jesse Ventura. He was a wizard. He conjured a daily spell that somehow convinced middle-aged, straight Christian white people that they had been maligned in America and their way of life was under attack. Threats around every corner and constant calls to arms. Neat trick. The profits from his writing and speaking had allowed Phil a sizable income, and with that he'd built a family compound somewhere deep in the Wyoming backcountry, set on the foothills that he called the Soothsayer. His critics called it the nut house that shit built. Phil didn't mind. You have to have your critics. They kept him charged and hungry and stayed high atop his ever-growing enemies list. As a believer in the impending Democrat-orchestrated apocalypse, Phil kept a large compound stocked with all manner of ordnance and munitions. There were security cameras and tripwires, and there may or may not have been landmines planted in certain areas of the property, depending on whom you asked, and whether or not you were a federal agent poking your fascist pig nose where it didn't belong. Insult to injury, some said Phil had built his compound on an ancient Native American burial ground. Horseshit, he thought. It couldn't be. He was the only true Native American, and he had the papers and documents to prove it, should anyone dare to challenge him. Phil awoke with a spring in his step on the morning of December 1st. He was a rabid Christian and a fan of holidays in general, but Christmas time was by far his favorite. It had nothing to do with the presents laced in bows or the hot chocolate bobbing with tiny perfect white marshmallows, or the garish jingling music or the pure white snow. It didn't even have anything to do with the birth of J.C., Phil's personal Lord, Savior, and wartime consigliere. Phil had a spring in his step because the godless sodomite queers and the ACLU hippie liberal douchebags were again mounting a campaign to destroy what Phil held most dear. And when Phil opened up his USB microphone and began recording his first No Shit Zone podcast of December, listeners could sense a definitive grin on his face as he spoke. The war on Christmas is here once again, fellow travelers. Now is the time to take the fight to them. These War on Christmas specials came every year like clockwork. Phil did 4 podcasts on the topic throughout December. 5 out of the 10 daily posts on his blog related to the anal rape of the Yule season in some way or the other. In one small Wisconsin town, the children of a local middle school were forced to say Happy Holidays in addition to Merry Christmas. It's true. A creche placed surreptitiously overnight on the lawn of a bank in San Diego was disassembled by disgruntled employees only hours later. Unbelievable. Phil ranted and he raved, and donations and book and DVD sales went through the roof. December went like it always did in the Stein household. Real nuclear family. Pretty blonde wife, 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, each cuter than the last. They had a golden retriever named Benedict Arnold, you know, as a constant reminder. Phil was at peace when he tucked the children into their beds early on the night of Christmas Eve. The compound, the Soothsayer, was all tinsel at that point, and the halls decked with mistletoe and lights twinkling so fiercely there was danger of bringing down Area 747s. Milk and cookies were laid carefully out on a stool near the fireplace, under the watchful eyes of marble busts of Nixon, Reagan, and Bush too. Around midnight, Phil would rise and take bites out of the cookies and leave only a half a glass of milk behind. And when he bedded his wife, Lucy, they made cold, calculated love in the missionary position. Lights off, shades drawn, covers pulled, no eye contact. Whispers of passion strictly prohibited. It was perfect. They both drifted to blissful sleep. All was well at the homestead. What first roused Phil was a clattering on the roof. At first he thought it was a dream. After a moment he realized it was the dream. It was the dream all anti-government militiamen share, to actually take a stand. And it happened so rarely. Phil thought he would never have his Waco, his Ruby Ridge, and it filled him with sour grief. But as the footsteps on the roof grew louder and more determined, he knew the moment had arrived, and he giggled with anticipation. The plan kicked into action. It had been rehearsed dozens of times. The wife, the kids, and the dog to the basement bunker. 10-inch thick steel reinforced concrete, a chemical toilet, a generator. They could hack it down there for a 5-month standoff if they had to. Phil kissed each of them goodbye, grabbed his 12-gauge, and headed off to sweet martyrdom with a smile on his face. He had been right all along. Why else would they be there if he hadn't been? He felt vindicated as he climbed the attic stairs, picturing Obama in the White House Situation Room, fingers laced together, rocking back and forth, awaiting updates on the progress of the siege. The dance was well choreographed, and Phil had rehearsed it many times. Throw open the hatch to the roof, level the shotgun, and start firing. Otherwise, there was that terrible possibility that they might not kill him, and he would be robbed of sweet martyrdom, a true human rights violation. As Phil steadied his hand against the handle of the hatch, he grinned and wondered if they would celebrate Phil Stein Day, in honor of the man who kicked off the revolution in tandem with the birth of Christ. Phil heaved, leapt up to the roof, and fired both barrels. Explosions of red on his periphery everywhere. Sweet blood, warm to the touch, still pumping out. Then, confusion hit him. Mixed with the red blood was red cloth and white material, almost like fur, dancing on the wind with the snow. A groan followed, and as Phil focused forward, he saw an overweight man with a large hole in his chest stagger and fall forward. His red and white hat, complete with a large fur tassel on the pointed end, fell off as he landed, and his round spectacles went clattering across the roof on impact. And then 18 pairs of broken eyes were upon Phil, and the pair nearest him, just inches above a glowing red nose, shed a single frozen tear. It was then that the horror came to Phil for the very first time. But there was no time to mourn. The team of 9 gave a loud bray in unison, a battle cry. Then they were off and up, circling the roof in ever-tightening figure eights, antlers pointed down in attack position. Phil steadied himself for the moment as the reindeer unhooked from their harnesses. The sleigh, now slave to gravity, went tumbling and landed atop Phil's brand new Hummer 3, turning it into a pancake of steel, plastic, and glass. It was then that he began firing as he screamed with fury. He was King Kong, armed with a shotgun. His roof was the Empire State Building. The reindeer were the biplanes. On it went for 15 minutes, and though they gave it a valiant effort, before long they had all fallen, riddled with buckshot, their wounds smoldering, gone. Gone Dasher, gone Dancer, gone Prancer and Vixen, dead Comet, dead Cupid, dead Donner and Blitzen. Rudolph was the last to fall. He landed feet from Phil on the roof and looked up with eyes that seemed to cry out, but on cute. Phil Stein found himself surrounded by silent carnage. His wife and children no doubt heard the gunfire, and yes, they could deal with him single-handedly slaughtering a task force of a dozen or so ATF and FBI agents. But he doubted they would look upon him kindly if they found he'd murdered Christmas. He formulated a plan quickly, and before he left the roof, he paused for only a single thought. How the fuck did Hillary pull this off? It only took an hour for Phil to assemble all the bodies on the lawn below. Then he retrieved his miniature bulldozer, now repurposed from its former use of fortifying earthen walls around the compound, and dug a deep mass grave on the property 50 yards to the south of the house. The corpses went in one after another. Quick work for destroying the wishes and dreams of billions of children in a single night. And as soon as he was packing the dirt atop them, encasing his shame forever, no witnesses, no inquiries, no martyrdom after all. As he entered the house through the back patio, Phil began to formulate his plan. It was a siege after all, yes. He'd taken out maybe half of them, and the remaining half dragged the bodies away, back to base camp, back to regroup. But they would return, and the family would need to prepare. Phil sat in a lazy boy in front of the fireplace and drowned his sorrows in 2% and snickerdoodles. He didn't hear the heavy rubber boots scraping across the tile of the kitchen before it was too late, and turned just in time to see fiery red eyes fall upon him, and the last thing he ever heard, was a booming, formally jolly voice rumble, "No, no, no." Just after dawn, the family emerged from the basement bunker. Visions of a pure democratic revolution driven by the 99% danced in their heads. But they found nothing, no sign of Phil Stein, no red and blue flashing lights of the fascist oppressors scouring the grounds for evidence, nothing. They gathered in the living room and wondered what came next. It was only a moment later that the little girl began shrieking with terror, and as the family followed her gaze to the Christmas tree, they followed suit. There laid Phil Stein, neatly wrapped in a dozen or so tight bundles of sinew and flesh, and tied with a bow made of his own entrails. And so, on Christmas Eve, after you've gone to bed, if you hear a clattering on your roof, fear not and sleep well, because it couldn't possibly be the Indian burial ground reanimated zombies of Santa Claus and his tiny reindeer. It just couldn't. Thank you.